What's up, guys? There's a lot to discuss here and not that much time to do it because I got to get out of here as usual. Hopefully, we can do it real quickly as I tend to do with these daily videos. I will mention that I probably will be doing like a college bowl video, one or two of them at some point. I mean, there are a ton of bowls to break down. We're up to we're at the point where there are like 40 something bowls now. It's like, really, come on, man, like 80 something teams, more than half of the teams in FBS football make bowls. The whole situation just gets ridiculous, and the lines come out and they just start moving like crazy almost right away. Because, well, I mean, I like to wait for like more information to come out in a lot of cases because like just firing off the bat without even like having all the info is kind of stupid. But then as the information comes in, that information tends to be, oh, like a bunch of these players on this particular team don't care about this game and they're just going to leave and like not play and enter the NFL draft and whatever. And you see that being the case with numerous teams. Notably this year, it's happening with Ohio State in their bowl against Missouri. Ohio State opened like a 7-point favorite in that one, which would be about accurate if like both teams are at full strength and had like equal motivation there. But obviously that's not going to be the case. Ohio State, they're one of the teams that I want to like play against in this bowl season because they're so close to being in the playoff, and they lost that game to Michigan, and like that just crushed their entire season. So they're like they're the epitome of disappointed team there. You want to go against these disappointed teams in the bowls. It's all about motivation. But Ohio State is like dropped now down to like a 2-point favorite. It's like, yeah, maybe you still want to jump in on Missouri as the underdog because like I just don't see Ohio State having like any motivation there at all. So it's like I still might do that, but you've lost like so much line value already. But these bowl games can just get completely insane. Like last year or 2 years ago, there was one bowl, the Western Michigan Nevada one, moved like 14 points from where it opened or something because Nevada was just like, it was obvious they weren't going to show up and a bunch of people dropped out. I don't even know, man. But that's what happens over the course of the bowl season. You have the lines out for like multiple weeks and they just move like crazy. So it's definitely overwhelming in a way. That plus there's so many games to look at, but I'll probably have to talk about it at some point. Usually I wind up on like 4 or 5 bowls, I would say, during the season, but we'll see. Rehashing last night though. Yeah, I went 2-1, which is good, obviously, with both NBA plays winning on the money line. Money line cashes with both underdogs, even though the Pelicans started out pretty bad, but they turned it around in a big way and just dominated the rest of the game. The Indiana Pacers played a really good game against my Celtics, unfortunately for the Celtics, but you can't bring bias into this, man. Like you got to go against the teams that are your favorite teams when the situation calls for it. And of course, if your team is good, then chances are you're not going to be finding line value on them as much as you're going to be finding it against them. So that was certainly the case with the Celtics there. Indiana played a really good game last night. So won on both of those. And these are those in-season NBA tournament, in-season tournament games, which the NBA they have this format now to like motivate teams in like regular season games where they otherwise wouldn't be motivated. But so far, like I've been crushing the NBA and I've just ignored that aspect of it completely. I've just treated them as if they were regular season games. Like I don't think that this in-season tournament stuff is that much of a motivating factor. It seems like it has not been so far. So it's like I've been fine just ignoring it so far. I don't know. I think it's total BS. Like it's still a regular season game, man. I don't care if you like call it a tournament and you like I don't know, you paint your floor differently. Although, of course, the winners of last night and then the winners of tonight's game, and I'm not going to be on either of the NBA games tonight, but they're the quarterfinals in this tournament or whatever, and all these winners of these games are going to be playing in Las Vegas in the semifinals and I guess the finals. So those won't be actually on the team's home floors. So it's going to be a little bit weird, a little bit interesting. But then, of course, the one game that I lost last night probably shouldn't have been a loss on Furman. They were within that number for the majority of the game, and it was a roller coaster because they were like within like 5 to 8 points almost the entire game, down 5 at the half. It was not that high scoring game. The second half wound up being way higher scoring. Arkansas pushed the lead to 20 at one point, and it was just like, I was like, all right, like it looks like this is probably going to be over, but Furman kind of just hung in there, and then it got down to the point where there's absolutely no way that they should not have covered. They were within 7 with like 40 seconds left, and it's just like, stop intentionally fouling, man. Like, you're not going to win the game. They intentionally fouled too many times, and while they were doing that, they only scored one more basket. They had like one layup for the remainder of the game there, which at the point where they got it, it cut the game back to like 7 or 8. So it was like, all right, like they're still probably going to cover the 12, even though they kept intentionally fouling, and they intentionally fouled one too many times. But even with all that and all the misses that they had, if they had made one of those shots that they missed, they probably would have covered. And if they had not intentionally fouled the last time, they probably would have still covered. And even after all that, Arkansas, because it's Eric Musselman, his players are out of control, man. Like, they tend to be a bunch of assholes. Eric Musselman's teams, you saw it with like the Nevada teams that were like smashing like fire, glass around like fire axes and whatever they were doing in the locker room after they lost that. I don't even remember what game it was. It was some big game. Their players are just out of control. Musselman, too emotional, like I said, doesn't really have control over his players. I mean, he's the one that like took his shirt off when they upset Kansas in the tournament last year, which I laughed. It was hilarious. And for my own sake, I wanted Kansas out of the tournament. But even so, it was like, his players just, they're out of control. And what happened last night, I was just so pissed because they could have just run out the clock. They were up 12. It was like, even that's bad enough. It's going to fall right on the number that I got, the 12. It's going to push, even though Furman was within 7 in the final minute. So it shouldn't have even gotten to that. But it's like, yeah, okay, like it's going to push. I'm really angry even then about that. But what does Arkansas do with like 4 seconds left? Maybe they could just run out the clock because Furman's just not going to intentionally foul anymore. No, they decide to run up the score and they dunk it. And then they even tried to do it again in the final like second or so after Furman missed one more shot there. It was so ridiculous, man. I was so mad. You can't run up the score like that, man. Like, I mean, show a little bit of sportsmanship there at least. Come on, man. And then so the game winds up falling on 14 instead. Oh, God. Yeah, fuck that. I hated that. That was one of the harder losses to take in a while, really. I was really angry. And luckily, the NBA games both got there, so it was still a decent night. And I got the pick right on the Cincinnati Bengals, but even so. And with Furman, by the way, I think I was slightly wrong that their best scorer from last year, I thought they'd lost him to graduation. I think he's still actually on the team, but he's injured right now. So either way, they're without him. But if he's coming back to that team at some point, I think they're going to definitely be dangerous in their conference again, at least. So moving on to today, I've got 4 plays here today. And I mentioned I'm not on any of the NBA stuff today. Let's go to the NHL first quickly here. Try to get this done quickly. There are definitely a few teams that I think are in bad spots, but it's just like the lines are just kind of a little bit too big for my liking, and I just don't love the spot that the opponents are in. So that would be the LA Kings, I think, have to be in a letdown spot after they come off beating the Colorado Avalanche, a huge win, but they're a huge favorite. They've gone down, though, from minus 220 to minus 215 on the road at Columbus. It looks like they have 83% of the tickets, but according to this, 99% of the cash. This is pregame. I think their numbers, especially in hockey, like early in the morning, I think those numbers are just not reflective of what's going on in the actual market, although the Kings probably are getting the public action for sure. But we see the line dropping a tick slightly. They're at Columbus. I do think it's a letdown spot. So if I were to take that, I would probably be looking to take, Columbus puck line, you have to take like -1. You have to lay minus 130 on it if you do it. So I don't know. It would be like a straight up money line play if I was actually doing it. But I don't think I can quite get there with it because Columbus is coming off a pretty big game of their own, playing the Bruins again, who they had beaten in the previous matchup between those two teams. And they lost this one to the Bruins, but it was still like a pretty big effort game for Columbus, I would say. Like they weren't out of that game really at any point. Until the end, I guess. But so they lost to the Bruins. They're coming off a pretty tough game, so I can't quite get there with it. The Islanders, I think, are in a bad spot, and that line is definitely dropping. They've gone from minus 305 down to minus 260. And it looks like they have 90% of the cash, but 81% of the tickets. But again, you see the line moving against where the public is there. So I think there is reverse line movement on the San Jose Sharks there. I've kind of avoided the Sharks games, or the Sharks are at least kind of playing decent hockey now to some extent at this point, and the Islanders are in a bad spot here. They're returning from a road trip, although they stayed on the East Coast, and it was only 3 games, but the final 2, well, all 3 games are tough. They lost to the Devils by 1, then they beat Carolina by 1. That's a big win, and then they beat the Panthers by 1, Florida Panthers. So those are big games. Those are big wins, max effort games. They won both games by 1 goal. Now they're returning home. They're certainly in a bad spot because it's going to be a distraction spot and possibly a letdown spot after back-to-back like big wins over Eastern Conference contenders. However, they do have 1 extra day off, but the thing that kind of just keeps me away from San Jose, other than the fact that, well, I would take the puck line on San Jose. I don't know what the price would be on it, but you might even be able to get 2.5 goals on San Jose if you really wanted to do it. You might have to lay like a price to do that. But the reason why I'm staying off of it, one reason is that San Jose just played a really tough game against the Rangers. They're playing their 4th straight road game, and they've played pretty tough games on the road trip. They lost to the Bruins, but then they beat the Devils, and the Devils have kind of been struggling recently, even though I thought they were a pretty good team, and they started out hot, but they haven't been good recently, but still kind of a big win for the Sharks, who really have not been playing well this year. And then the Sharks played a tough game against the Rangers in the last game and lost 6-5, even though, yeah, they were down 6-3 in the 3rd period there, but they did not let up, man. They kept attacking, they kept trying, so that's a max effort game, and that's kind of what keeps me off of it. They played like a big effort game against the Rangers. So, yeah, it just keeps you off of it a little bit there slightly. And then I think there was one other game that I thought there was a team in a bad spot. I don't remember what it was. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But the play that I'm going to be on is going to be on the Minnesota Wild. And it looks like there is reverse line movement on the Minnesota Wild. I see them as having opened a plus 100 underdog, but now they're up to a minus 110 road favorite. Although that's like with the VIG included, so that kind of means like a pick'em price right now where both teams would be minus 110. But it looks like the line is moving in Minnesota's direction despite being on the road. It's flipping the favorite to Minnesota, at least with the way it's moving right now, even though according to pregame, Minnesota's got 50% of the tickets, but Calgary has 88% of the cash. I'm not sure I totally buy those numbers there either, because the line movement looks like it's going opposite Calgary. And I think Calgary's in a bad spot. So this is why I'm doing it, why I'm on Minnesota here. Calgary, I mean, yeah, they're 1 game below 500 now, but well, at least if you don't factor in the overtime losses, they're coming off a tough stretch of games, man. They've been at home this whole time, and yeah, they have 2 days off this time, but even ending their road trip that they had prior to coming home, they've played a bunch of tough games in a row. They beat Dallas on the road, which is a game I was on. And Dallas was in a bad spot in that one, and Calgary won that game and scored 7 goals against them. Then they lost to Colorado. They came back home with 1 day off, and they were playing a bunch of games in a packed, really tight schedule. There were not many days off. They returned home, and they beat Vegas in overtime. They had 2 days off, stayed at home, and they beat Dallas in overtime. So that's a bunch of really big games in a row. Dallas, Colorado, Vegas, Dallas, and that was all in a span of 7 days. And they won 3 out of 4 of those, the last 2 being in overtime. And then they had 1 more day off, and then they played another tough game against Vancouver at home. So you think maybe they're in a letdown spot at some point here, but here is where I think kind of the hangover comes in, because I think you don't really suffer a letdown when you're playing Vancouver, because Vancouver is a pretty good team. And Calgary was hanging around in that game, even though they were down 2 goals in the 3rd period there. They didn't really let up. Like, they kept playing, even though they were down 2 again, and then they scored like a goal kind of in garbage time, but they were down 1 goal in the final like minute and a half of that game, and they gave up an empty netter, and then they still kept trying, and they were on the power play, and they cut it back to 1 in the final minute. So they were definitely putting in a big effort in that one. If you look at the stats there, they had more shots than Vancouver, although that only by 1, and that might have been because they were behind. They had more hits than Vancouver, so they were playing the more physical game there. I think after that, it's just not a good spot for Calgary, man. After that just crazy stretch of games, all these like big effort games in a row. Now you have a below 500 team coming in. Minnesota, this might be like the spot where you're a little bit hungover. And you got Carolina up next, even though they're Eastern Conference, they are a team with a pretty good record right now, winning record. Minnesota, man, I mean, they were on a really bad loss streak for a while. They've lost a bunch of games in a row, 6 or 7 games in a row or something, and then they've won their last 3. And they only have 1 day off, but their last game was not really a tough one. They beat Chicago, and they were 5-10-4 at one point. Now they're 8-10-4. So they kind of have the momentum right now at the very least, and they're starting a road trip. So I think it is a positive, even though they won that single game that they played back at home against Chicago. It wasn't really like a big effort game or anything like that. They won pretty easily. Now they're going out on the road, even though they do have Vancouver coming up next. I think when you're a below 500 team, you tend to not really come like unfocused, like unless you're coming off of some like huge game or something. I think you still maintain that focus, especially when you're going out on the road. You're starting the road trip. You tend to want to get that off on the right foot if there aren't really other factors in play. So I like it, and I think the market looks like it's in agreement with me on that one. So it's going to be the Minnesota Wild. I laid minus 106, I believe, on that one. So that's going to be play number 1, Minnesota Wild. And then we're going to have 3 college basketball plays, man. And there are other college basketball games that there are teams that are in bad spots that a bunch of teams that are in bad spots, and I'm fading some of them, but laying off of some of them. So Georgia Tech is certainly in a bad spot. They just upset Duke. So that's huge. Duke getting upset by multiple teams here. However, I don't think I can quite fade Georgia Tech here because they're playing Georgia, and that's like a big in-state rivalry, and it's kind of hard to even determine at this point which team kind of considers themselves the little brother in that matchup at this point. So Georgia is up from 5 to 5.5. I don't see percentages on like any of these games yet on this board, but it looks like the line is kind of moving in Georgia's direction, but I can't quite get there with it, even though I think Georgia Tech is in a letdown spot. Georgia. I think Georgia is, I think Georgia Tech is probably still going to be focused on Georgia there. So even though Georgia's coming off that game where I went against them, they didn't cover against Mercer, which I don't know. Will that cause them to be focused a little bit on Georgia Tech? Yeah, maybe. I would still lean against Georgia Tech because they're coming off such a big upset there, but I can't quite get there with it because it is like a rivalry. I think they'll still be focused. Washington, I think, is certainly in a bad spot, but it's just a mismatch where they're laying too many points. I don't really want to get involved there, but I would only lean to Montana State in this one. Washington's coming off a tough game where they lost to Colorado State by 5, and they have their in-state bigger brother Gonzaga next. That's a huge game coming up on Saturday, I believe. So it is a sandwich spot for Washington. So I would not want anything to do with Washington there. I just can't quite get there just because I think it's enough of a mismatch that it's a little bit dicey. Montana State's not very good. I don't think they're as good as they have been in the recent years. I think they lost some of those players that they had in some of those good seasons that they had. So I can't quite get there with that one, but it is a bad spot for Washington. And then Kansas, I think, is also in a sandwich spot. It is definitely a bad spot for Kansas. Like, there's obviously no reason to lay Kansas here. It's just they're probably like a 30-point favorite or something, or 20-something. I just can't quite do it, man. Again, when it's that much of a mismatch. But they're coming off beating UConn. They beat the returning champs. That was a huge win there. They've played like a really tough slew of games there. Pretty much in the last 4 games, they played Marquette, Tennessee, and UConn, 3 of the last 4. And 4 of the last 6, you can throw Kentucky in there as one of their opponents too. And they won all of those games except for the Marquette one. So they're coming up beating the returning champs, though, in UConn. I think they're going to not be totally focused here against UMKC. And UMKC, University of Missouri, Kansas City, they are I wouldn't say they're an in-state little brother because they're in Missouri, but they are a Kansas City team, so they still might have kind of that little brother aspect to it because they're right on the border, man. I think it's a big game for them. They're going to want to like show some pride and like play a decent game against Kansas. They have like one of the big teams of college basketball that they're up against here, so I think it is a much bigger game for UMKC. And it's a sandwich for Kansas coming off that huge win over UConn. And they have Missouri and then Indiana up after this. So bigger name teams coming up after this. I think it is certainly a major letdown situation for Kansas. And if they were up against somebody more competitive, I'd be going against Kansas here, but I just can't quite get there with it. Kansas is they're actually down from a 28-point favorite to a 26-point favorite with juice. But yeah, I'm just not going to get involved in that one. But Kansas is certainly in a bad spot situationally there. Getting to the actual plays, we got 3 of them. And I think Tennessee is in a bad spot too. How do I keep missing all these? I don't think I can quite get there with them either for similar reasons, but they just lost to North Carolina after they lost. Well, they just played Purdue, Kansas, and North Carolina and played all those games close. So they're coming off a tough stretch of games, even though they lost all 3 of those. That's a really difficult stretch of games to come off. And they have a ranked Illinois team up next on Saturday. So, again, they're kind of in a sandwich spot there. And they got George Mason coming in. George Mason has been playing well, but they haven't really faced a very difficult schedule. Tennessee's up from 15 to 16 in this one. I'm not going to quite get there with George Mason either. But, again, Tennessee is also in a bad spot. So I will point that out. And then let's get to the actual plays here. Play number 1 is going to be against Xavier. I think this is a mega sandwich spot for Xavier here, man. I'm playing on Delaware here. Xavier, what did I take? I took Delaware plus 12.5, and the line is moving, man. I think it's probably 11.5 at most places now. So the line looks like it's moving in my direction in all these games. Xavier actually opened in this one a 14-point favorite, it looks like, and they're down to 11.5 with juice. So you might be able to find 12s around. I'm on 12.5. Again, and this is a bad spot for Xavier, and I think Ken Palm probably has this at about 12 or 13, somewhere right in the range of where the number is. So not really much to glean from that, really. Xavier, they're coming off a really tough game against Houston, man. Houston remains one of the top teams in college basketball. That was a huge game. Xavier was a big underdog at home, 8.5-point underdog. They played real tough, man. They were down fairly big. They were down double digits for a lot of that game in the second half, and they came all the way back. And I believe they took the lead at one point or tied it. They might have had the lead in the second half. They didn't go away, and they played real tough, and they wound up losing by 6. And they just they stayed within the number for the rest of the game. That was a tough, pretty physical battle there against a really tough Houston team. So Xavier's coming off that. That was a mega game. And who do they have up next after this? They have their in-city rival, Cincinnati. That Xavier Cincinnati game. Cincinnati's been playing well this year, too. I think they're a 1-loss team, or they might be undefeated. I don't even know what they are. But Xavier Cincinnati, that always winds up being a really physical, heated battle. These teams tend to hate each other. Those schools hate each other. They're in-city rivals. That is a huge game as well. This is a big-time sandwich spot, man. If you know the rivalry between Xavier and Cincinnati, that is a huge game coming up for them on Saturday, and they're coming off that real physical game against Houston. So this is a physical sandwich as well. Just, yeah, playing a Colonial Athletic team in Delaware right here, sandwiched in between Houston and Cincinnati. That's not a good spot for Xavier at all. Delaware, they're coming off a game where they played pretty tough as a big underdog too, but I think they might have started looking ahead to this big game against Xavier at some point there, because they were playing at Ohio, although Ohio is one of the better teams in the MAC. Ohio was a big favorite in that one, actually a 7.5-point favorite. Delaware was winning most of that game. They had a lead for almost the entirety of that game, and they wound up blowing it and letting it slip right near the end. And maybe they thought they had the game in hand, and they were starting to look ahead to the Xavier game, man. I don't know. Normally I would not want to totally be on a team in a position that Delaware is in, where they played an opponent that had played a big favorite, really tough, like they did against Ohio. They're played tough as a pretty big underdog there, but they're not going to be unfocused, man. I don't think, when they got Xavier coming in. Like I said, I think they might have started looking ahead and had a lapse in focus at the end of that Ohio game because they had Xavier coming up next. I think it's a big game. Xavier's a big name team here. It's a Big East team. Big game for Delaware coming up here. I think they're going to have to show up focus here. And the line movement looks like it's in agreement with these, like I said, Xavier's in a mega sandwich spot here, like maybe the biggest sandwich that I could see on the day. And the line is competitive enough, and the line movement looks like it is in agreement with me. So I'm doing it. I'm taking Delaware, and maybe because they like had that big lead and they let it slip there, maybe that's going to cause them to like regain a little bit of focus there because they had that game in hand and they just let it slip away. It's and it was against, well, it was still against like a MAC team, even though they were a pretty big underdog. So this is a bigger game for Delaware for sure. I like Delaware. I'm on it. Plus 12.5. The other game I'm on, I'm actually fading KenPom here by laying Michigan State minus 5.5. And Michigan State looks like they've gone up from 4.5 to 5.5. KenPom has this game at about 3, which it's a little bit dicey when you're fading the KenPom ratings a little bit here, but I think this is a bad situation for Wisconsin and Michigan State. As the line is telling you, they are actually the better team. Well, KenPom actually has Wisconsin as slightly the better team. I don't know if I totally agree with that. I think as the odds makers usually are not wrong, even though KenPom, you can find like some situations where the odds makers are wrong and KenPom is right. I think it's more likely the odds makers are right, and maybe there's something going on with like an injury or something like that, or maybe it's factoring in the situation here. But I think this is a bad spot for Wisconsin, man. They just got into the rankings. They had a massive upset on their own floor. Well, it was a massive upset ranking-wise because they beat the number 3 team in the country in Marquette. And up next on Saturday, they have the newly anointed number 1 team in Arizona next. So it's weird to say that this in conference, like Big Ten opener here is a sandwich spot, but I think it kind of is because Wisconsin is coming off that huge game against Marquette. That was like a court storming type of win. I think the crowd probably did storm the court when they beat number 3 like that, even though it was only like a 3-point upset or something. And I pointed out, I liked Wisconsin in that game. The line looked suspicious. This line looks suspicious though, because how is Michigan State, who's unranked and has a worse record, how are they laying 5.5 against a ranked Wisconsin team that just beat Marquette? Michigan State hasn't really shown much yet, although, of course, 2 of their losses are to Duke and Arizona. Can't really blame them for those losses against good teams. They don't really have anything upcoming, and I think their last game was a nice tune-up where they blew out Georgia Southern. I think that's a game that can kind of like help you like regain some momentum after that tough Arizona game. Michigan, I think, is in the much better spot, regaining some momentum there. Wisconsin is actually in a sandwich spot and in a huge letdown spot there. I'm laying it with Michigan State. And then finally, what's the other game that I'm on? I forget what I'm even on. I got to get out of here. Princeton, -8. Let's do it, man. Princeton's up from 7.5 to 8 against Drexel. This is like a pretty straightforward handicap here, I would say. Princeton against Drexel. Drexel, they're coming off a huge win, like win of the season. Their biggest game of the year, man. They upset Villanova in that Philadelphia tournament that's going on there. That's an in-city like little brother situation there where Drexel beat like the beast of Philadelphia. They beat the biggest team in Philadelphia, man. Ranked Villanova, huge upset. That was probably a double-digit upset for Drexel, right? Yeah, 10.5. That's a huge win for Drexel. Now they got to go on the road to play Princeton, and they got West Virginia up next on Saturday, which is that's probably their only other like big conference team that's on their schedule this year. So this is sandwiched in between their 2 games that are against bigger conference teams, between a Big East and a Big 12 opponent here. They get to go and play an Ivy, even though Princeton is maybe the best team in the Ivy. It's still, man, it's a difficult spot. You're coming off like game of the year type stuff there. Upset of the year for Drexel there against Villanova. That was huge. West Virginia on deck. You might, even though Princeton is still like a good team, a good opponent, you might like you might slip up a little bit here. You might not show your best here at Princeton. And Princeton, I think they're in a good spot to like play a better game here. They saw what Drexel just did for one thing, but they just played a game against Furman. And I don't want to mention that Furman team again, but Princeton shot really poorly, like more poorly than they normally would. They were only 12%, 13% from 3-point range. That's un-Princeton like, really. Only 36% from the floor, also un-Princeton like. And even though Furman Furman had 19 turnovers, which is basically why Princeton won that game. Princeton escaped, man. Princeton was a 6.5-point favorite, and Furman was beating them the whole game, basically. And Princeton somehow wound up winning right at the end, probably because of all the Furman turnovers. Princeton wound up somehow escaping. When you're a favorite like that and you escape like that, I think that tends to like shock you back into focus. So that's what I'm doing there. Princeton -8. So real quickly before I get out of here, college basketball plays are Delaware +12.5, Michigan State -5.5, Princeton -8, and in hockey, I'm on the Minnesota Wild -106. Let's do it, man. Let's have a good Tuesday. Peace out.